All right, good afternoon, and welcome to the Sustainable Materials Management Webinar Series, a joint effort between the National Recycling Coalition and the Pennsylvania Recycling Market Center. My name is Wayne Bowen, and I'm the Program Manager for the Market Center and will serve as your moderator today. We would like to extend a special thanks to Bob Hollis of the Mobius Network for providing the webinar management software for this series, and Lisa Ruggiero of the National Recycling Coalition for providing technical support. Today's webinar will focus on compost tea. Our presenter today is Mr. Mark King, who I'll introduce in a moment. Following Mark's presentation, we will conduct a question and answer session. If you have a question or comment, please use the GoToWebinar dialog box located in the control panel on your screen. You may also use the dialog box to request assistance if you're experiencing technical difficulties during this webinar. Please note that an edited version of this webinar will be made available for viewing via YouTube links on the National Recycling Coalition and Pennsylvania Recycling Market Center websites. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter. Mark King is a native of Winthrop, Maine, where he enjoys spending time hunting and fishing. He has a bachelor's degree in biology from the University of Maine and a master's degree in zoology from Southern Illinois University. In 1991, Mark started working with the Maine Department of Environmental Protection as an environmental specialist. In 1993, he joined the Maine Compost Team, a collaborative interagency group consisting of representatives from the Maine DEP, Department of Agriculture, State Planning Office, and the University of Maine Cooperative Extension, where he developed an expertise in composting. In 1997, Mark served as one of the founders of the internationally acclaimed Maine Compost School and currently serves as the director, as well as actively participating in course instruction. And by the way, I'm a recent graduate of this school. Mark provides an ongoing technical assistance to new and existing compost facilities through facility siting and design support, operations assistance, and compost process troubleshooting. Mark has worked with all levels of compost facility design and has developed an expertise with medium and large scale facilities. Currently, he is promoting statewide composting of pre- and post-consumer food residuals as an alternative to costly landfill disposal. And now we'll hand the program over to Mark.
Thank you very much, Wayne. Very happy to be here today. What I'd like to talk to you folks about for a short period of time today is the use of compost and compost tea in order to suppress plant and soil-borne pathogens. Before we get into what compost tea is and how it's made, we need to sort of understand what makes soils healthy and what we're looking for when we try to build a soil up and make it more prone to be resistant to pathogens. First thing is you have to have an adequate supply of macro and micronutrients. The macronutrients are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and then the micronutrients, which are often overlooked, are iron, boron, manganese, zinc, cobalt, and molybdenum. These micronutrients play a critical role in how plants take up the other nutrients. You also need to have a strong cation exchange capacity, often referred to as the CEC. The cation exchange capacity is the ability of the soil to hold on to these nutrients, the micro and macro, excuse me for that, and also how to let them go when they're used by the plants. You also have to have an adequate moisture holding capacity because that's where a lot of the microorganisms are going to be found in your soil. You need to make sure that you keep that at roughly somewhere in the neighborhood of 45 to 50%. Another important factor is the soil's ability to make aggregate particles which help determine the structure of the soil itself, and that's referred to as the cohesion. And finally, the best soils, the soils that are most vibrant, have a very complex soil life, which we'll see on the next slide. As you can see, a really good soil food web consists of macroscopic organisms, including voles and bugs and worms, right down to the microscopic organisms and even the detritus that provides a lot of the nutrients for the plants. One of the things that compost and compost tea do is they help to provide a functioning food web as it's put into the soil, and oftentimes will revive a very poor soil. Next slide, please. Some of the pathogen organisms that we're constantly concerned about include the big four, which are Pythium, which causes a lot of the root rot of many plants, Rhizoctonia, which is a big one for us here in Maine because of our potato crops, causing the black scurf, Fusarium, which is responsible for a lot of the wilt that we see across the country, and then another big one for the state of Maine and Idaho and other states that produce potatoes is Phytophthora, which causes potato blight. Next one, please. This slide really very nicely demonstrates what happens to a plant when it gets diseases, and also will illustrate a point of why I believe that compost and compost tea need to be used simultaneously in order to have a desired disease suppressive effect. If you take a look at the top side of the plant above the soil, you can see the leaf blight, some of the cankers, the simple leaf spots, the wilt, and the rot that often is associated as plants express varying stages of the disease. But if you'll also notice, simultaneously a lot of times disease is also occurring below the soil, and that becomes a real problem if you only focus on looking at the top side part. So we advocate that you work in compost tea into the soil and oftentimes compost itself to inoculate your plant sort of from the top side and the bottom side simultaneously. The next one, please. One of the things that's really important to understand about diseases and disease expressivity is that there has to be sort of a perfect storm of effects in order for a disease to really have an impact. Oftentimes you'll hear about blight, or you'll hear of some disease that goes through the state that you're in having different effects in different locations. The reason why this occurs is that these three factors must be present for the disease to have any impact whatsoever. And that is, you must have a plant that's struggling in some way. Either it's malnourished, maybe not enough moisture, so it's very susceptible to disease. The pathogen that comes through must be very virulent, have a strong pathogenic expression to it. And then the environment that it lands upon has to be favorable for it to propagate rapidly. When all three of those things occur simultaneously, then the perfect storm happens and you can have some massive disease expression in a crop. And it's something that we try to avoid as much as possible. Next, please. One of the other things that's really important to note is there are 5 major steps in disease control. And I'm not looking at the first 3 at all when I talk about compost and compost tea. The first 2, exclusion and avoidance, are specifically looking at a way of keeping the pathogen away from the host plant. A lot of times that involves disinfecting a full row or growth of plants or coming up with some sort of chemical spray. Eradication looks at, once the disease hits, destroying the crop that's affected and then getting rid of the pathogen to prevent it from further expression throughout the different areas nearby. So all 3 of those are really kind of a strategy that's done to prevent spread. What we're looking at is, if it hits us, we want to find a way to protect our plants, which means that we treat them and make them healthy and strong before the disease comes, or we do what's called resistance training, which is you actually give the plant compost tea, compost, and you wake up a genetic kind of concoction inside of them that makes them even stronger when the disease does come through. Excuse me. Next, please. And we will talk more about the induced systemic resistance, because that's a very exciting part of this field. One of the big kind of players right now, especially in the organic world, is this concept of biological versus non-biological disease control. Many man-made chemicals that have been traditionally used on crops for years and years and years are not the best option. They tend to be the first option drawn because they are very effective. However, they not only target the plants that they're trying to protect, but they also target other non-specific plants. They also often have a quarantine period because of the potential to cause illness to humans and other organisms. When they're spread in such a way that they are broadcast in the air and often can drift, resulting in carryover of pesticides and herbicides in areas where they're not wanted, and they're extremely expensive. It's a very economically non-feasible manner once you get into it. What compost tea offers is kind of the opposite. It's all natural and non-harmful. There are no quarantine periods. You usually apply it topically and also as a root drench. And as such, with both the foliage and the root system, we see that the application can be done numerous times without any harmful effects. The only problem with compost tea applications is that the material is water-based, and when it's sprayed onto a plant, if it doesn't land on a flat surface, it can run right off because there's nothing that causes it to etch itself into the plant surface, whereas a man-made chemical oftentimes will work itself into the plant cells due to a special etching agent that gets it inside of there. So compost tea is something that quite often has to be reapplied, especially if it rains directly after an application. Next, please. This just shows you an example of the pesticide drift and the problems that occur with it. It can be very problematic, especially if a place that you're trying to work is adjacent to a school, a hospital, a nursing home. So there are always concerns about where exactly is this pesticide going and how can I protect people from overspray. Next, please. So as far as what is compost tea, it's very, very simple when you think about it. You take a filter bag, a bag that basically will hold compost but yet allow water to flow in and out, and you place it into a measured amount of water, and you let it sit for a period of time. We call it steeping. And as it sits there and soaks, osmosis and diffusion draws different parts of the compost, the microorganisms and some of the microsubstrates into the water, and it flows back and forth. And occasionally, as you stir it, it helps to induce the mixing process. There is one step further that a lot of companies have taken it, where they'll actually add aeration. And what aeration does is it helps to speed the mixing. It helps to cause more effective oxygenation of the compost tea, to which there's a lot of debate whether or not that has any impact whatsoever. But as such, it tends to work pretty good. However, the one problem that we see with a lot of folks that make compost tea, and it's a reason why the National Organics program has gotten on board on this, is that a lot of folks have tried to add stuff to the compost tea to make it sticky. One of the most popular has been molasses. And when you add molasses to the compost tea, it makes it stick to the leaves and it makes it stay around a lot longer. The problem is that these, especially molasses being a high sugar source, these types of additives can actually take the pathogens that were subdued by the compost process and give them an opportunity to regrow and become vigorous, and you can actually be putting pathogenic organisms back onto the plants that you're trying to protect. So there's a very special limitation on that, which I will get to. Next slide, please. So what does it contain? And this is really kind of an interesting thing, because there are tons and tons of different organisms that end up in the compost tea. You know, you have your plant nutrients, the humic acids that are part of the compost, active bacteria, fungi. Fungi are really one of the groups of organisms that have been found to have really good pathogen suppression effects. Protozoans and nematodes, the little teeny round worms you see microscopically in soil. And then other products of these organisms that can have antibiotic properties, which is one of the mechanisms that makes the compost tea so effective. So why are we looking at this? Well, one of the big issues right now is there's a huge concern of where our food's coming from and what we're doing to grow it, and how we're trying to make it less preservative laden. So as a result, we've had a huge demand for organic products. You go into stores now and there are separate aisles that, you know, you have the organic route and you have the non-traditional or the more traditional route of using pesticides. The other thing that's really important is, as the organic system is growing in popularity, there is a lack of guidance for organic farmers on how to protect their crops. What's out there is the things they can't do. There's nothing that talks about the things they can do, because they're trying to grow stuff naturally and pesticides and herbicides are not allowed. So what kind of things come up? And so organic farmers have kind of led the charge in using compost tea, because it is a fairly holistic, natural way. But because it's not regulated by the federal government too effectively, there's a lot of concern that compost tea might be utilized that isn't appropriate for use. So there's been a tremendous amount of federal oversight looking at this and trying to come up with reasonable standards for the use of compost tea, and we'll discuss those at the end. Next, please. So some of the uses of compost tea, you can put it on your plant leaves, It's excellent for disease suppression of both the plants and the root system. Always recommend both areas be applied simultaneously. Other places where it's had a lot of effect, people that do a lot of cutting, they have wood chip piles and things like that. They found that adding extracts of yeast, compost tea, and other microbiological solutions have facilitated the decomposition of the residue, which makes it kind of a nice extra side use for the material. And then some of the big ones that are really important are enhanced soil biology by adding that kind of reviving the soil with that neat microbiological system, and then also dealing with suppression of pests and other crop problems. Next, please. So the benefits, and this is really kind of an overstatement in some ways, but yeah, I would be foolish not to tell you that one of the most important benefits is there is a nutrient application. We call it a growth promoter. There are things in compost tea that definitely enhance plants that not using compost tea would not do. But disease control of both the foliar and the root system are definitely a benefit, and then the inoculation, as I said earlier, of the functioning soil food web. Okay, next please. So it's really important to always think about tea and compost as being something that should be used together. The research has definitely supported over the years compost use in soil systems for pathogen reduction. Compost tea is still one of those ones that's very heavily studied, but it's very hard to replicate because of the fact that how it's applied, it's catch or catch can, whether or not it's going to actually land and stick on where it should go. So there are a lot of times where you don't get a fully well-balanced study because of the way it's applied, or it happens to rain the day it's applied and it's not replicated. But the idea is that you use them both together, tea and compost in the soil, and then foliar spray on the plants themselves, which is the compost tea extract. Next, please. One of the really important things to note, though, and this is one of the first things that the federal government tried to do, is they thought, well, if we pasteurize it, it'll kill any diseases in it. The unfortunate part is that if you do pasteurize it, it'll also kill all the good guys. So heating compost tea will render it ineffective because basically the organisms that are doing the disease suppression will also be wiped out in that process. So we don't really consider that a good thing. Next, please. So, of course, the literature out there has been going since the early 90s. And for as many studies that will show you that this does work super well, especially amongst tomatoes, potatoes, grapes, and strawberries, those are the ones that are prone to the fruit mold. There have been tons and tons of studies that show it does work. And each specific compost feedstock has a better suited produce than another. But the problem is that as you're trying to do a controlled replicated study, there are so many variables that you can't always control that it results in a lot of unscientific type presentations. So as a result, what we try to do when we're promoting this is to not say it's the end-all be-all for everything, but that when used judiciously as part of a regular crop rotation, as part of a regular growing system, and used judiciously following specific guidelines, it will help protect your crops from any disease progression. Well, we're not going to say that it is the end-all be-all, because in a lot of cases it doesn't work, and that's sometimes due just to the way that it's utilized. And that's why we need some strong guidance on how people should utilize compost tea. Next, please. So this is really kind of the meat and potatoes of why compost tea is so effective. There are 5 really good pathways of disease suppression that you see happening in compost tea. The first is called basically competition, and that is that you take a compost tea, a fresh compost that's been through the process, it's well-aged, well-mature, it's a really good compost. You make a compost tea, you apply it to the foliar surface of a leaf, and it grows rapidly and successfully because it's vigorous. On that same leaf is a pathogenic organism, and it outcompetes that organism to the detriment of that organism. So competition is one of the best documented ways that compost tea can work. Another thing that happens, especially with things like leaf and yard compost, is the phenols that are produced as part of that process actually have antibiotic properties. And when placed in a compost tea and then applied to the plant, they can actually wipe out the bacteria that are on the surface. So that becomes a neat thing. There are also organisms in the compost tea that can secrete antibiotic secretions, which also have the same effect, making them very interesting to study as well. And then the third way is, if you can't outcompete, then why don't you just eat them up? So predation. They basically consume the organism and take the energy from that organism and make it part of their own. So those are three very aggressive ways. The two that I find really intriguing myself as a researcher are the induced systemic resistance and the growth promotion, which go hand in hand. What happens is that, similar to when we give our children a vaccination for a childhood disease, when we apply the compost and the compost tea to a plant, we actually wake up the genetic resistance within that organism, and we wake it up and allow them to express it. So if a disease does come through, they're more apt to resist it than one that doesn't have the compost tea applied to it. So it's a very exciting field. There's still a lot of research that's ongoing out there, and every day you can actually find new studies where they show where this has been very successful. But the whole concept is the growth promotion helps to increase this systemic resistance. Next, please. You got to always have a gratuitous picture. Both of these plants here were treated, well, the one on the right was treated with compost, and the one on the left was not, and they both were exposed to Pythium, and as you can see, the one on the right got better. Now, this research was done in the early 90s, back before induced systemic resistance was really heavily well known. So the thought was that basically the reason why the Pythium didn't have a chance to attack that plant was because it was stronger and more vigorous just due to the growth promotion. The induced systemic resistance theory that came out probably about 10 or maybe 11 years ago would say that maybe what happened was that the genetic system of that plant was woken up and made it much more resistant to the Pythium. So just an interesting side note. Next, please. So you can buy all kinds of additives. One of the ones that's been isolated that's really kind of cool is trichoderma. Trichoderma is a fungi that has been found to have antibiotic secretions and to be especially good at getting rid of both Pythium and Phytophthora. Now, most compost that you manufacture based on farm materials, leaf and yard, will have a certain amount of trichoderma in it anyways. But there are companies that have isolated this specific organism that you can then add to your compost tea in order to help make it more prone to be able to attack that. And of course, if you're a potato grower and you're scared to death of Phytophthora, then you're going to do whatever it takes to make that happen. And if you're an organic potato grower, it's going to be especially interesting to do that. Next, please. So as far as the antibiosis, what we're talking about is basically these organisms, either bacteria, yeast, or fungi, especially trichoderma, will secrete either an amino acid, a phenol system. Sometimes it can be a protein. It's something that is foreign to the organism that is the pathogen and causes it to be less vigorous. One of the things I learned a long time ago from Will Brinton, he has a lab here in Maine, is that to be a pathogen requires a bit of energy. And pathogens often carry around a plasmid, sort of like a backpack. And when they are stressed, they get rid of their pathogenicity before they succumb themselves to whatever's happening. So sometimes just these little simple things can cause them to become less vigorous, and thus they become inactivated. Next, please. This is an example of a bacteria dealing with a pathogenic fungi, and they're just secreting their compounds, which are restricting the growth of that, and eventually they'll drive it down to where they can consume it, and it'll be gone. But that just shows you one of the effects that can occur. Next, please. Parasitism is a very interesting one, and as you can see, Harry Hoytink is one of the very famous researchers that's been doing a lot of work on this. And trichoderma can eradicate things like rhizoctonia just by simply wiping it out, and that's a really cool process. But as you can see, this induced systemic resistance that also comes with the compost tea basically means that the plant puts up more defense compounds produced when it's applied. You know, it's faced with this compost or compost tea. So it's like an immunization that makes it stronger and more vigorous. Next, please. This is a really, really great slide. This is from a very early work done by Woods End back in the day. I would say this is probably 93, 94. But this is when trichoderma was first being investigated. Will's lab did quite a bit of work with it. But if you look at the bottom slide, what it shows you, starting at the top left and working kind of clockwise around, is that you can see that the trichoderma is dropped onto the agar plate, and in essence it outgrows and basically consumes that fusarial colony. And that's kind of the whole mechanism of how these work with the parasitization. It's a very interesting concept of how it works, but it's really the survival of the fittest if you think about it at best. Next, please. This is just another couple shots of the colonization that occurs. Trichoderma colonizing Pythium, and trichoderma actually puncturing the cell wall of Rhizoctonia. Any kind of damage as such, either outcompeting them for food or damaging their cell wall, results in the detriment of the pathogen, and then the pathogen ends up going away. And that's kind of really a pretty cool concept of how we hope that things are going to work with this system. Next, please. So this is just looking at the composting process for people that need to kind of take a step backwards. The way that it works is you start out with the active phase, which runs somewhere between 5 to 8 weeks of composting. Then along comes a curing phase, and the curing phase is really kind of a double-edged sword. If you've had a really good active composting experience, the curing phase lets it finish out. What a lot of folks do is they'll drive their process quickly, may not necessarily have a good active compost phase, but by having a prolonged curing phase up to like 6 months, any woes in the compost are kind of taken care of slowly over time. So in the case of the active phase, we're looking at temperatures of 131 to 140 degrees, whereas during the curing phase, you're looking more closer to ambient, maybe 110 down to 80 or so. And then eventually it gets to ambient temperature level. But what's happening is the microbes are consuming all the carbon and nitrogen that they can. They're producing a very strong, complex, humic-based compound that then, when added to the soil, is like an ATM. It holds on to nutrients for a very long period of time and lets them go very slowly but very carefully over time. So compost, when added to a soil, is not a fertilizer, but a soil conditioner that allows that soil to better utilize its nutrients, and if it takes on nutrients, to better distribute them over time. Next, please. One of the things that's really important to also note, I was asked very early on about compost teas, whether or not a leachate could be used as a compost tea, and the short answer was, well, if you need it as an herbicide, absolutely. Because the idea of using a compost to make a compost tea is it needs to be very mature. And what that means is that the compost has completed the process, there's no longer any cellular respiration, there's no longer any materials that are the raw feedstock or any other components that are detrimental. A lot of the salts have been taken away, so it's not going to be phytotoxic when applied to the ground. And in the case of making a compost tea, if you do not have a very mature compost, it will amplify all the negative aspects of the compost and make basically a leachate out of the tea. So you've really got to be sure that you have a very mature, well-balanced compost before you make a tea out of it. Next, please. And as I said, the immature compost can act as an herbicide. One of the most common processes that we see that happen is in a static aerated pile, especially in a large system where they're using biosolids or some other material, and it's rapidly dried for a prolonged period of time. What you find is that once it comes out of that system, it looks and smells like it's fairly stable until it's moistened, broken up, and reworked. Then all of a sudden it takes off because it was artificially stabilized by having all the moisture taken away. But the second it's re-wetted, it takes off again and can be very problematic. So we want to be sure of what material we use before we put it in, otherwise we're not going to do ourselves a very good service. Next, please. Another very important thing is that, as I said earlier, compost tea does not equal leachate. Very important to note that, and that's something that we want to put out there as being very important. I think you have to hit another one to get that. There you go. All right, and then next, please. Simultaneously, we don't want to confuse it with what we call a manure-based tea. A manure tea is actually used for its nutrient availability, and this is a very common practice, especially among organic farmers. This is a good thing. It's where they're actually using the nutrients to kind of liquefy them and get them to the root system. So this is okay, but this is not applied to the plants as a disease suppressant. It's applied specifically as a fertilizer source. Next, please. This is a very simple recipe that ever since we've had the compost school, we've kind of put out as a challenge for our school attendees. And the idea is, you take 1 gallon of compost, take a 1 gallon Ziploc bag, put compost in it, dump that onto a permeable cloth, like a cheesecloth, roll that over and sew the edges, so you basically have like a little baggie, and then you place that into 5 gallons of room temperature water, preferably non-chlorinated, and you soak it for about 3 days at room temperature, stirring 3 or 4 times. And what I have down here is that if you do want to add a surfactant to make it sticky, Woods End has isolated a tween 20 or a new film 117 that will make it sticky but does not add to the regrowth potential for like E. coli. And then what you do is you pour that same material through cheesecloth to pick up the suspended solids and put that in a container, and you apply it as soon as possible. And preferably they want you to do it every 7 days. And the challenge that I've kind of given to the compost school students is that if you were to take that cheesecloth bag, attach a small piece of rope or twine to it, and then made a little label, you'd have a compost tea bag. And then if you took a 5 gallon pail and stuck a little decal on it, you could actually have yourself a little business, compost tea, ready to go. So it's just kind of an opportunity for someone that's an entrepreneur. Next, please. Now we're going to kind of go through some systems. Aerating the compost tea is a very popular thing, and at a minimum, a lot of the federal standards are thinking that aeration is the minimum standard. You can't just not aerate. It's still really, honestly, anybody's guess on whether or not that does a whole lot. I have some charts in a minute I'll show you about what happens during the aeration process, but it isn't really a significant difference. And there have been some studies that have shown that there's no significant difference in the pathogen reduction of aerated versus non-aerated, but for whatever reason it makes people feel better about compost tea. So if that's what it takes to get it in vogue, then that's fine with me. Next, please. A couple of different systems. The one on the top right is kind of the same concept that I just talked about with my tea bag idea. The difference is that the green thing that hangs on the side of the bucket inside is actually an aeration device, and then you'll see that they've got a little jug of molasses there or other extracts that can go in. So that's kind of a do-it-yourself. It's a little more expensive than a 5 gallon pail and a tea bag would be, but something works. And then the one on the far left is that same system but larger. It looks like it holds close to maybe 15, 16 gallons. Next, please. This is really kind of the more popular one you see out there. These guys are pretty much located all over the U.S. and they've had people using them everywhere. They do have up to a 500 gallon size container, which is ideal for most properties, most small orchards, things like that. So it does become very popular to people looking for a way to kind of create a tea that's large scale. Next, please. So now I just want to show you some slides of what happens when compost tea is actually brewing, just so you can get a sense of what's going on. The first slide coming right up here looks at dissolved oxygen and nitrate, and you can see that as you're bubbling oxygen in, it does help. You're allowing the microbes within of the fluid to get oxygen, to be as aerobic as possible, which is always a good thing. As a result, you see an upping of the amount of nitrate that's produced. But even so, it's really not necessarily the end-all, be-all as far as whether that's going to make it a better tea or not. There really just isn't enough compelling literature that says one way or the other. Next, please. pH, you see some mild fluctuation, but as you can see, I mean, we're talking about 0.2 change, which can be significant. It's as far as it's a negative logarithmic scale, so fairly significant changes. But once again, I mean, the pH, we can deal with things from 6.2 to 7.2 and not have any concerns. So once again, not enough to push me over the edge. And then temperature-wise, you can see that there really isn't a big deal there either. We're talking about tenths of a change. So it's a matter of do you feel better about this with an aeration system involved? And if that's what it takes, then that really becomes your driver. Next, please. So this is the National Organic Program Standards, and this is kind of something that's important. They don't mind if you use a compost and you steep it for less than an hour, and then you use that stuff right away. Their concern there is that it doesn't have enough time for the pathogens to regrow and the pathogens to get in the extract. Simultaneously, if it's steeped for more than 1 hour and it's aerated, they want you to have a 10 to 50 part water to 1 part compost, pretty dilute, and you must aerate for 12 to 24 hours and then use right away. If it's not aerated, it's 3 to 10 parts water to 1 part compost, and you can soak it up to 3 weeks, stirring occasionally. So the idea is that their belief is that in the agitated system, there's more chance of you driving those pathogens, or if you're going to have pathogen regrowth, you're driving them into the system. So they want to see that used right away in a shorter duration of steeping time. And you know, that's not an undoable standard. It's nothing that I think has made it impossible. Next. The other thing they want you to do is they want you to use, and they have a very specific standard on what they consider to be really good compost. Most cases it's well aged, well matured, has been through a long curing period. The materials that were used to make it were all organically certified. So it's not impossible either, but it's a little bit stricter to look at. Things they don't have restrictions on are compost tea that you didn't add anything to, and any compost extract. And if you add a compost additive, it must meet the EPA water quality for E. coli and Enterococci standards. And once again, that basically means that it cannot contribute to the potential pathogen regrowth like a molasses would do. Some of the other things, though, that can be a bit problemsome for organic farmers is that if you use a tea that's untested or not certified by them, you can't use it for 90 to 100 days prior to harvesting a crop, and that can be a problem. Also, if you apply raw manure or any extracts onto the soil, then once again you have a 90 to 100 day pre-harvest restriction. And then the things that are prohibited under their stand. Whoops, excuse me. Can you go back for a second, Wayne? And then the final thing is that the use of teas for edible sprout production or foliar application of raw manure, because raw manure can have E. coli in it. So once again, that's a concern. All right, next please. So some of the basic tenets: that it's undiluted watery extracts are prepared 3 to 10 days before the use using mature microbiologically active compost. Now that sounds like a contradictory statement, but what we mean by that is that it's mature and there are microbiological populations, but they're still not thermogenically active in that all the food has been consumed and the resident microbes are there, but there's no heat being produced because there's no further composting occurring. So that's what that means. Animal manure compost is one of the best and most effective after it's been through the whole process and cured. Coarse filtration is really, really good. The surfactant is an optional piece and not necessary. You just have to apply more often, and then spray as needed and repeat. The next slide, please. This is kind of a funny slide. This is how I end all my shows. In 2000, our compost team went to Melbourne, Australia to do a compost school for them. We were guests of the government. And when I got into the airport, there were all these dogs walking around, and I didn't get a chance to see what they had on their vest, but they kept hanging around my suitcase, and I said to the guy, I don't have any drugs. I'm here for composting, you know, no problems or anything. And he said, well, do you have any fruit? Do you have any food? I said, well, yeah, I've got peanut butter crackers. And he goes, that's all got to be thrown away. I said, what do you mean? we don't really care about drugs as much as we do our native flora and fauna. These dogs are to make sure that you don't cause us any diseases that are going to upset the balance of our environment. And I thought that was pretty cool because I had never seen that before. And it just showed me how important this whole idea of pathogen suppression truly can be. And I think that's my last slide.
Yes, it is, Mark, and thank you for that excellent presentation. We're now going to field some questions from our presenters. Again, if you do have a question, please enter them into the GoToWebinar dialog box. And looks like we have a few already, so I'm going to start with those. Okay, this attendee is asking about the FDA Food Safety Modernization Act and its regulation of compost tea applications on human consumption plantings. Is it just as strict, if not stricter, than compost application?
It is. The long and the short, it is. It's a very lengthy, verbose document, and it specifically is broken down by genre of food that you're working with, which is really good. But once again, when you start putting the word organic on anything, there are tremendous hurdles that you must overcome in order to maintain that status.
Okay. This attendee's requesting maybe or listing some peer-reviewed papers showing the suppression pathways.
Mm-hmm. So would you like me to pull some of those papers and make them available to you to put up on the web?
Sure. What I could do is perhaps if you give me a list, I could add a slide to this webinar when I edit it, and then that could be made available.
Yeah, so it'll take me a couple days. I'm out tomorrow, but I will put together some papers on that.
Right. And maybe I'll give you the attendee's email address, and you can do that offline.
Okay, that'd be great.
Okay. This question, is there a biological difference between compost and vermicompost tea?
There is. The processes are a bit different. In the case of vermicomposting, it's actually really digestion. And so the net product is a little bit different. The digestive products that come out of the worm tend to be a little bit more nutrient rich than a compost. Because in the case of composting, you're taking carbon, nitrogen, and you're combining them together, and you create these sort of complex compounds that are really hard to break down. Whereas with the case of the worms, they tend to be more available nutrient-wise. And that would also reflect in the tea itself as well.
Okay. What is the shelf life of compost tea?
That's a really great question. If it is left on the shelf uncovered, in other words, if you create a bucket of it, and you let it sit, you could use it within 72 hours. If you place it in a jar and put a lid on it, it'll go septic within 24 hours. And when I mean septic, once it goes anaerobic, it'll actually start to smell.
Okay, this is kind of a follow-up to the vermicomposting one. They assume it's not recommended to use worm castings for making the tea, but what if they are added to the normal compost?
That would be great, and I will tell you that there is a gentleman here in Maine who, his name is John Dyer. His website is Black Gold, and he actually makes a worm casting tea, which is used by the golf course in his hometown. It's a national type golf course, and they have found that it has very good fungicidal suppressive qualities as an extract. So it's not necessarily that it's not suitable. It has its applications, and John is very specific on how he tells people to make it. So if that's someone you're interested in, it's called Black Gold, and the gentleman's name is John Dyer from Belgrade, Maine.
Okay. This question, I'm sure this person's watching from his smartphone at a home improvement center. Okay. Can the Lowe's bag manure be used to make compost tea?
Lowe's bag manure, and the short answer is no, because animal manure will make a manure-based tea, which will still have a lot of activity in it. And the biggest way for me to place it is that you have a lot of amino acids and other compounds that are not broken down by the microbiological process involved in composting, And as a result, those enzymes, those enzymes and the other factors that are in that manure make it almost phytotoxic. The other aspect too is that raw manure-based type bag manure will be high in salinity, and that'll be phytotoxic to plants as well because it draws water away from their root systems. So really that's more useful when blended into the soil and the salinity has a chance to be kind of diluted out.
Okay. Have you identified a list of parameters that are desirable to analyze for compost that would be good to use in producing compost tea?
Yeah, there are quite a few. I mean, everybody's got a different kind of set of standards on the web, but our general rule of thumb is that the material had a proper seed-end ratio, proper moisture balance, proper porosity, and had a proper salinity at the start. So the recipe was ideal. The material had a 6 to 8 week period where thermophilic temperatures in excess of 131 degrees were met for an extended period of time. The compost then was placed into a thoughtful curing system where it had at least 3 to 6 months of really good prolonged curing, and prior to being made into the compost tea, it was tested for maturity and shown that it was very mature and stable. Those are the criteria that would be the most important, but another factor that is really critical is that you take an analysis of the compost before you put it in the compost tea, and you want a seed-end ratio of, somewhere in the ratio of 19 to 20. You want to have your salinity less than 4 millimoles per centimeter, and you want to make sure that the material does not have any other types of activity when it's placed into like a Dewar's flask or Sovita kit.
The trend in organic operations seems to be toward extract versus tea to get around some of the pre-harvest restrictions imposed by the NOP. Can you discuss in more detail the differences in these two products and how are they used?
Oh, go ahead.
And how are they used?
Yep. An extract is basically made in a very short period of time, less than an hour, and that's used as kind of a drench. And the advantage of the extract is that it does allow you to kind of get something on your crop. It does not have the same therapeutic value as the compost tea, which is a much longer steeping process. But there is a thought out there that the extract may be sufficient, especially if you don't have enough time to create the tea, given that, for example, there's a blight that just got reported in the town next to where you are, and you don't have those 3 or 4 days to kind of get it done. So just a different mentality.
Should soil application occur before planting or after the plants are established?
How about both? Because that's really the best answer. A really good cropping system should have compost added at all phases of development. Before you plant, while you're planting, and after you put the crop to bed in the winter. Because the idea is that you're building up soil structure. By adding the compost, you're adding the soil structure, the water holding capability, and you're also providing that pathogen resistance. And it's like a food bank. It's there when people need it.
This is just a comment concerning worm casting tea. This person, I'll mention his name, Bill Peregrine.
Okay.
He services hundreds of residential customers in the Pacific Northwest and has a 100-gallon brewer and only brews with worm castings. So.
And I'm sure he does very well. As I said, John Dyer, he's a pretty cool guy. I wish that you could have seen him when you came to compost school. He ran an analytical lab for many, many, many years, and he has produced the most perfect worm tea that people are just dying to use, and he's perfected it by just trial and error. He does his own plant studies in his basement, and a very clever guy. Another person that I'll mention who I know personally that's a really great guy that does a lot with worms is Jack Chambers from Sonoma Valley Worm Farm out in California. Another excellent resource to contact about worm tea. Someone who would be able to give you some good insight.
Here's a good question. If heat renders compost tea ineffective, can it be produced through non-aeration production outdoors in South Texas, where temperatures get in the 90s and hundreds in the summer?
Yes. We're talking about, when we talk about heating compost tea, we're talking about pasteurizing temperatures in excess of 190 degrees, 70 degrees C. So it's you were talking super, super hot. Because remember, the compost process itself can get up to 160, 170, but when you have that prolonged pasteurization, that's what wipes the tea out.
Okay, here's another good question. This person will be doing compost tea for a small-scale, non-commercial garden. For this, is it okay to use homemade compost that has not had a heating phase to make the tea?
Everything that I have read says no, because it depends. One of the things it does depend on are the feedstocks. If any of the feedstocks that went into the compost are manure-based, where they can have E. coli or other pathogenic organisms, then it is considered to be very worrisome to create a compost tea from that. If you're using leaves and grass clippings from your own property and maybe food scraps from your home operation, it might or might not have a benefit depending upon how good a process is, but in most cases, if it doesn't meet the thermophilic temperatures, it's not considered to be a good use of that material.
Okay, this next question, I think the person likes to multitask. Can compost tea be made in a rain barrel?
Oh, sure. As a matter of fact, we have a potato farmer who, up in, we call it the Crown of Maine, in northern Maine, who actually sells seed potatoes all over the world, and that's his job. And he makes compost tea in rain barrels, and then he has irrigation systems where it kind of drips all over his seed cultivars. And he's a strong believer. You just have to add more. If you have a rain barrel that's 55 gallons, then you would raise it up to 11 gallons of compost. It'd be the same ratio as my 1:5 for the 5-gallon pail. So you'd use basically an 11-gallon size, which would be probably, I would say, half a pillowcase, and stick that inside, and that would soak in the 55 gallons of water.
Okay. I think that's all the questions.
Sounds good.
Great set of questions. I really appreciate the good responses. And so we're now going to close the webinar. And as I said before, this webinar has been recorded and will be made available via YouTube links on both the National Recycling Coalition and Recycling Market Center websites. Thank you again for joining us. We hope you'll join us for next month's webinar. Please visit the NRC and RMC websites for schedule updates. And thank you again, Mark, for taking the time out of your day to make this presentation, and have a great day.
Thank you, and thanks for having me.